Everyone's excited down at my house. Everyone's delighted there. Soon you'll be invited down to my house, down to a joyous affair. Can't you see I'm happy, happy and gay? See the look of joy in my eyes. You'll never guess why I'm feeling this way, so here's the reason why. Somebody's coming to my house, somebody's coming to stay. Father feels so happy, he's jumping with joy. All he keeps saying is, I hope it's a boy. Welcome is waiting the stranger who'll come to brighten our lives. I can hear Mother croon, he'll be president soon when the cute little stranger arrives.
On July 14, 1946, Wilfred Kesterton, an officer in the Canadian Army stationed in England, wrote to his sister Edith, "Last Sunday afternoon, a couple of other officers and myself took a quick run down to Portsmouth, where we saw Nelson's flagship, the Victory, on which Nelson died during the Battle of Trafalgar. We visited the spot on the quarterdeck where he was hit and the place amidships where he died. The port bow has a big hole in it, but it was Hitler rather than Napoleon who put that there. Near the ship is a big museum filled with Nelson's and other naval mementos. The death mask of Nelson is in the museum, as well as documents in his handwriting." Wilfred Kesterton was unaware that he was walking the streets and paths close to a drama and near tragedy which had determined his very existence. This we didn't learn until 60 years later, 10 years after Wilf's death. It was 1801, and the location was that same Portsmouth naval docks. William Kesterton, great-great-great-grandfather of Wilfred Kesterton, a master-at-arms on the HMS Anson, had been taken to the Haslar Naval Hospital, where he had died on June the 2nd, 1801, 145 years before Wilf and his fellow officers toured Portsmouth. William's widow, Sarah, and their two children, George, aged 2, and Benjamin, aged 7, were at risk, along with their mother, of starving to death. Food and even water had to be brought into the residence of Portsmouth. There was no relief or support for a widow either from the Navy or the local government. She was at the total mercy of her neighbors and relatives. We do not know what killed William, only that if something was not done soon, Wilfred Kesterton and hundreds of other descendants of William and Sarah would have never existed. On June the 16th, 1801, the following correspondence, written on behalf of Sarah, since she couldn't write, to her mother-in-law, Mary Kesterton, who lived in the Midlands with her husband Benjamin Kesterton, a master whitesmith and grandfather of the two little boys. "Dear Mother, I once more take the opportunity of writing to you and hope that you are in perfect health. I am as well as can be expected, considering the loss of my dear husband, which to me is a very great affliction. And I am in such a situation that I know not which way to get bread for my children. So, dear Mother, I beg that you will be so good to go to the parish officers at Aston and say my case before them." Although the response was unknown, Sarah was successful, because later records show young Benjamin living in Dudley, married and employed as a whitesmith, suggesting that his grandfather had taken him on as an apprentice in the trade. 2-year-old George somehow wound up in Shropshire as a chimney sweep, while the widow Sarah lived in Dudley, probably with her son Benjamin, until her death in 1829. Wilfred Kesterton was born in Regina, Saskatchewan in 1914. He was the oldest child of Ernest and Eva Kesterton. 8 years later, his brother Morris, Mike, was born, and 2 years after that, his sister Edith rounded out the family. He grew up during the Depression years in Regina and Moose Jaw, and was later to become a teacher in the Saskatchewan Dust Bowl years. As the nephews of Wilf, my brother and I benefited from his amazing visits. He taught us chess, card games of strategy, and took us on field trips to parks and museums, then led us on birding expeditions. The final treat was a stop at the movie house. I would have preferred Tarzan, but Uncle Will thought a Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis flick was more suitable. As the result of these visits, I one day announced that I planned on becoming the bachelor uncle in the family. My father gave me a tolerant look, as if to say, "How do you think you would be here otherwise, Buster?" Before going on, it is imperative that you hear Wilf's voice. This means jumping forward to February 1991. Wilf was asked to provide a radio tribute to Eugene Forsey, a Canadian senator and constitutional expert who at one time was a part-time professor at Carleton University and a neighbor of Wilf's.
Eugene Forsey died last Wednesday at the age of 86 after a life dedicated to scholarship and public service. Wilfred Kesterton, a professor emeritus at Carleton University, counted him as a distinguished friend.
I boarded with Eugene Forsey's aunt and uncle in the 1950s. I saw Dr. Forsey occasionally at Carleton University when Canada's political gadfly was a part-time professor there. But I didn't get to know him well until he moved into my apartment building a few years ago. Then we got better acquainted. Once in the elevator, I asked him, when did Canada abandon the convention of requiring private members to be re-elected before they could enter the cabinet? Forsey's answer was short. It wasn't a convention, it was the law. Dr. Forsey was a tough-minded person.
At some point in Wilf's retirement, he started writing, "This is how it seemed to me," a brief autobiography. I was born on July 22, 1914. World War I began August 2nd, 11 days later. A coincidence, I think. Like some other people I know, I had ancestors. Most of them lived in the English Midlands. My parents furnished a few sketchy details about my immediate forebears, and a family Bible held a modicum of history. But the real detective work was done by my younger nephew David. Such genealogical searching brought the worrisome thought that some of my ancestors might have been illustrious literary or artistic or political or ecclesiastical figures. More hopefully, I dared speculate that I shared the bloodline of sheep stealers or highwaymen. What I found was that my ancestors seemed to be neither famous nor criminally notorious. The males included whitesmiths, fitters, cordwainers, charter masters, nailers, shoebinders, compositors, printers, and iron molders. My parents had the good sense to avoid the Regina cyclone of 1912 by waiting until 1913 to leave West Bromwich, a Staffordshire suburb of Birmingham, and to travel by train and steamship and train to faraway Saskatchewan. I'm going to interrupt Wilf's account at this point for what later research revealed. Eva Mary Hughes, Wilf's mother, had been alienated from her Catholic mother, whose parents emigrated from Ireland in the 1860s. Wilf's grandparents rarely remained at home, happily dumping the young Eva with relatives. Still grieving from the death of her father 5 years earlier, that had dashed all plans of their emigrating to South Africa and dooming her to the life as an iron molder, Eva had no siblings and no reason to remain in World War I England. It was then that she met a mild-mannered religious young man in the Methodist Church. Ernest Harold Kesterton, Wilf's father, came from a large family of 13 children, all of whom cared greatly for their parents and siblings. The wedding assembly photograph shows Ernest's parents and 12 siblings carefully assembled. It was the day of their marriage. Ernest is dressed in his wedding suit, having posed earlier with Eva in her wedding gown. Ernest was deeply committed to his parents, his hard-working but oppressed mother, who was addicted to the bottle that had to be smuggled in by her sympathetic children, yet still supportive of his tyrannical father, whose strong moral upbringing included such sayings as, "A place for everything and everything in its place." Not all of the children in the family photograph were available to attend Ernest and Eva's marriage, but someone had cared enough to bring them all together one final time. Of those in the back row, Winifred, who floats in the air second from the right, was dead, having passed away from appendicitis at age 12 3 years earlier. This gave rise to the legend of the family portrait as having been a ghost photograph. However, light pencil marks around the original portrait showed where Winifred's image had been cut out to be added to the portrait at a later date. Since the sun was shining through the trees and the boys had the shadows of leaves on their jackets, it's fairly easy to see that 2 other siblings were not present that day, the 15th of February, 1913. Edwin, the eldest son and second child of George and Jane Kesterton, had married and left 4 years earlier and was now living in a log cabin in Saskatchewan. Edwin's family and Ernest's were to complete the Canadian branches that were to have a close relationship throughout the following decades. Son Walter appears not to have been present, even though there was no reason for him to be absent. He was a 20-year-old clerk at a chemical works who was destined to be married later that same year, then to have 1 child in 1914, but to die in the winter of that same year along with his child. It was the strong-willed Eva, Wilf's mother, who most likely convinced her husband to leave England and live close to his brother Edwin in Saskatchewan, where the air was clean, deaths from tuberculosis were non-existent, and the opportunities for a productive life abounded. To briefly return to 1801, when Wilf's great-great-great-grandfather died in Portsmouth, this led to his great-great-grandfather becoming a whitesmith master. Whitesmithing meant working with white metals, tin and pewter, or polishing iron, with the emphasis on making and polishing of firearms. That was Benjamin Kesterton, Wilf's great-great-grandfather, who was born in 1794 and died in 1854. The youngest son of Benjamin, Charles Kesterton, was living at home, unmarried, and present at his father's death. He not only created a listing of siblings, presumably for the purpose of the will, but he began his own family and our branch of the Kesterton family Bible. Charles himself became a whitesmith and firearm polisher, marrying Maria Hill and having 11 children. The profession was passed on to some of his children and influenced others, including George Kesterton, the grandfather of Wilfred, who became a type maker and compositor. Wilf's father started out in the same field, ultimately leading him to becoming a typewriter salesman in Saskatchewan and eventually manager of Underwood Typewriters in Regina. This influenced all of his children, Wilf becoming a teacher and journalist, Wilf's brother Mike becoming a photojournalist and magazine editor, and Wilf's sister Edith, after winning top marks in typing, becoming a secretary for the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Of Mike's children, my brother Michael worked as a proofreader and eventually a Globe and Mail columnist. I did whatever I had to support being a writer and an author. As children, we had typewriters in abundance to play with, creating our own one-issue family newspapers before we were 12. The unexpected death of William Kesterton, the Master-at-Arms, in 1801, had become the kickstart for a sequence of events that directed and influenced his descendants through the paths of whitesmithing, typesetting, typewriters, journalism, and writing. This is important in understanding the roots of Wilfred Harold Kesterton in his eventual role as a journalism luminary. Here is the Director of Journalism and Communication at Carleton University, Mr. Christopher Waddell, introducing the 14th Annual Kesterton Lecture.
The Kesterton Lecture is named after Wilf Kesterton, who was the key figure in the early days in the growth of Carleton's journalism program. He was born in 1914 and he was initially a teacher. He joined the Army in 1942 as a private and remained in the Army till 1947. At that point, he came to study at Carleton. In 1949, Wilf Kesterton became the second faculty member hired by the school, and he taught media law and other subjects to virtually every student at the school until his retirement in 1979. He stayed as a professor emeritus till 1986, and he died in 1997. He was an extraordinary teacher, a pioneer in the writing of journalism history in Canada, and also played a great role in examining the relationship between journalism and the law. Shortly after his death, the school launched a major fundraising campaign to create the Kesterton Endowment Fund, which, among other things, supports this lecture.
Wilf's books include what have become standard references for all Canadian journalism studies: A History of Journalism in Canada, 1967, and The Law and the Press in Canada, 1976. Getting back to Wilf's incomplete biography. My parents settled in Regina, where, as I have said, I was born July 22, 1914. A reading of the Regina Leader Post of that date shows that, were it not for my arrival, the day would have been singularly unmemorable. Children gain awareness early, but remembrance comes rather later. That is why, of the first 2 or 3 years of my life, which were spent in Regina, I have little memory. I don't really remember the burning of the Kaiser in effigy, but I do remember remembering that Regina event. Sometime during those early years, I must have accompanied my parents to Saskatoon, where they lived briefly. In one respect, my folks must have found that city congenial, because it was first known as Temperance City, because it sought teetotalers to be its citizens. My parents were inflexible teetotalers all their lives. In her late 70s, my mother began to suffer from a heart condition, and her doctor prescribed a daily spoonful of brandy. Once, when I visited her on a holiday, she commissioned me to get a Mickey of the liquor. Months later, the bottle was still half full. When I turned 5, I became fully aware for the first time of myself and my surrounding. By then, not quite sure of when or how I arrived there, I was in Moose Jaw. Then, innocent, I did not realize that lesser mortals, not fortunate enough to live in the town I came soon to love, spoke disparagingly of the place where I spent 16 impressionable years, and that they told ludicrously inappropriate jokes about its physical contours, its manners and mores, and above all, its name. Writing now in retrospect, I recall the calumnies of outsiders. In the days when Maclean's magazine used Reader's Digest devices to provide brief brighteners, one absentee barbarian solemnly announced that Moose Jaw's main street was so narrow that when workmen painted its white center line, the line overlapped onto the sidewalk. Moose Jawites, I like the word Moose Javians just as well, who explored eastward soon learned that Regina and central Canada are the places where the streets are narrow. But fair's fair, of course. In 1938, Queen's roommate Martin O'Connell, later a Pearson government cabinet minister, accompanied me as we left our Stewart Street boarding house in Kingston. I looked along the tree-lined sidewalks. "What big trees," I said. Martin comes from British Columbia. He looked along the tree-lined sidewalks. "What small trees," he said. Years later, Don McGillivray, former Southern economics columnist, and I went separately to see the film Atlantic City in an Ottawa cinema. My reaction to it was like this. As he explains, I was sitting in an Ottawa theater recently watching a film called Atlantic City. It's set in New Jersey and stars Burt Lancaster, but it has some Canadian actors and references as befits a movie made with the help of Canadian taxpayers. At one point, a young punk was knifed by a drug courier from whom he had stolen some dope. His body is sent back to his native Saskatchewan, and his ungrieving wife orders some flowers sent to his funeral. "Where to?" the florist asked. "Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan," the girl replied. The people in the theater chuckled at that. "It's near Medicine Hat," the girl on the screen volunteered. Like New York is near Washington, I thought to myself. But the people around me were laughing at Medicine Hat. "It'll be the biggest social event Moose Jaw has seen in years," she said. That got an even bigger laugh. Wilf continues, "When at the age of about 4 I first became conscious of Moose Jaw, it was the town rather than the surrounding countryside I first knew. We lived in the back of my father's typewriter shop at 26 High Street East. On Halloween night, 1918 or 1919, after I had gone to bed, a sudden explosion blew out the large plate glass window at the front of the store. A minimum of detective work quickly disclosed the fact that the damage had resulted from a prank played by a young employee who said he had simply intended to create a loud noise to frighten our family. Undoubtedly, it was youthful timidity that made me unnecessarily concerned about the 9 p.m. curfew that was then enforced. If I remember correctly, it applied to all children under 16 years of age, and it was announced nightly by the tolling of a loud-voiced bell. Because Victoria Public School was only about a block and a half from where we lived, I had only a short walk to the kindergarten I attended when I was 5. That school experience passed quickly. When I turned 6, we moved to River Park in the southeast section of the city, living in one of the 3 or 4 homes that were almost completely engulfed by a widely extended woodland. The surrounding trees were Sherwood Forest. Robin Hood himself loomed above those who lived in the southwest part of the city, a giant green and red figure painted on the tall mill where flour was made. I was in grade 1. There I received a strapping and untraumatic experience I recall. My offense had been to daydream during oral reading and thereby lose my place in the Alexandra primer, so that when I was called upon to read, I greeted the summons with silence. At 6, I think I was precocious, with early alert to words that were not commonplace. At home one day I encountered a fly and tried out a newly acquired phrase, "I'll castrate you." My mother responded with cool aplomb that I think she may never have matched later, an aplomb I have marveled at over the years. "You don't mean that. What you mean is, I'll castigate you." In 1920, when we lived in River Park, my brother, Morris Hughes Kesterton, was born. He never liked the name Morris, and years later he was much relieved when his Air Force companions rechristened him Mike. A baby still in River Park, he endured whooping cough. He and I and most other children of that day suffered through most of the childhood diseases: measles, German measles, chickenpox, scarlet fever, influenza. I think my young acquaintances and I escaped smallpox and diphtheria. Nor were such childhood diseases suffered anonymously. Quarantine signs were tacked on innumerable doors throughout the city to advertise the afflictions of those within. Different colored placards were used to differentiate among a varied menu of assorted diseases. At this point, I'm going to interrupt the autobiography to show you what Wilfred Kesterton looked like. You, of course, have the photographs, but now I'm going to show you a few minutes from a movie. This was made from color Kodak stock that had been given to my father. There's no sound. Most of the film was shot earlier, from 1948 to 1951, but on this bright sunny day, Uncle Wilfred was visiting Regina, staying with his parents who were a few blocks away. The builder of the kite is Michael, my brother, who's wearing the red tie. I'm the one in blue. What I want you to see from these rare short scenes is Wilfred as the sympathetic teacher who is well aware that he is performing in a silent film. As a caring instructor, he patiently allowed my brother to believe that the aerodynamically hopeless kite, built with a wooden frame that may be too thick and heavy to allow for flight, might actually perform. It never did, much to my brother's hands-on-hips disappointment. My uncle used his silent movie performance to suggest that the cause of the failure was not a technologically useless design, but the fact that there was no wind. Then my uncle walks away like a silent film comedian, bobbing from side to side, in sympathy with my disappointed brother. This is the only film footage I have of my uncle. He is 38 years old, and the year is 1952. The last scene shows Wilf pushing the wagon loaded with my brother and myself, which is being pulled by our father. Returning to Wilf's story in his own words. At the end of my grade 1 year, my family moved to Hochelaga Street, in a more central part of the town. Our stay was a brief one. I attended grade 2 in Alexandra Public School for about 2 months, after which we moved again. Our new home was at 1331 Redland Avenue. Years later, Colin Thatcher was to live at 1116 Redland before he was convicted of having his wife murdered. But our world was different from that of the residents of the 1200 and lower numbered blocks. Moose Jawites, who lived in other parts of the city, enjoyed the amenities of civilization. We in the coulee were inured to a more primitive existence. Probably because of the contours of the land, we had no water or sewer services. As a result, we depended on the waterman, who paid frequent and regular visits to bring pails of water. Price, 5 cents a pail, which he poured into the tall, galvanized cylinder that stood in our kitchen. In our basement, a large cistern collected the rain which had fallen on our roof to provide water for the washing of clothes and bodies. Lacking indoor plumbing, we made use of a standard piece of coulee architecture called invariably the back house. Inside the backhouse, human excrement was deposited in large, heavy iron pails, and lime was copiously used. A toiler of the night, whose odoriferous duty was to remove the unwanted excreta, made his regular rounds with an ominous vehicle faintly suggestive of an army tank. We gave it the euphemistic name, the honey wagon, and of course the valiant, indispensable public servant who drove it was always called the honey man. Refrigerators had not yet appeared. Instead, we had an ice box which held 25-pound blocks of ice, which were delivered regularly with the help of wide-mouthed tongs. Each block cost 25 cents. Bread was delivered every weekday. Coal was delivered as needed, and certainly in winter it was needed in large quantities. We had twice-a-day mail deliveries. Milk was delivered every day, including Sundays and holidays. In our home we did have electricity. That is why we Cooley residents felt no more deprived than other Moose Jaw citizens the winter there was a citywide power failure that lasted 3 or 6 weeks. The outage had been caused by the breakdown of a major piece of large equipment that could not be replaced and that had to be replaced by a piece of machinery sent by surface transport from the United Kingdom. The inconvenience we suffered related more to light than heat, because in that era coal rather than electricity kept us warm and cooked our food. Certainly I heard no talk of lawsuits such as were threatened in Ottawa more than half a century later, when a blown transformer deprived sections of the nation's capital of power for 3 days. I can think of no place better than the Cooley from 1922 to 1930 to spend boyhood years, ages 8 to 16. We were on the edge of town and country. My friends and I dug a labyrinthine cave where wavering candles were the antidote to darkness. It was in the pond that I learned to swim. As we went skinny dipping, we found that bloodsuckers were eager to form attachments, but we soon learned that if we chipped small pieces from the salt licks the farmer had put out for the cattle, and then applied the saline deterrent to the small animals, they would writhe vigorously and leave. I think I was 13 when we found a March 25th day to be so unbelievably warm and the prairie so incredibly snowless that we dived into the pond. Immediately we disturbed the breathtakingly cold water. Thereupon a submerged raft rose like Excalibur and released a prairie iceberg. Our retreat was swift. Later, when I taught in rural schools, far from a view even of towns much smaller than Moose Jaw, I looked at telephone wires, traced them with my eyes to where they disappeared on the northern horizon, traced them with my eyes to where they disappeared on the southern horizon, and I knew that I was beholding unbroken circles of wire that circumnavigated the earth. Wilf proceeds to identify and comment on the Saskatchewan prairie plants and flowers, and later the prairie birds. From this I recall him taking my brother and I on field trips where we were required to list the birds that we saw. Throughout his wartime letters home to family, I find he has a strong interest in the birds and flowers of England. He always seemed to take the events as being of some great significance, a feature I have never encountered in anyone else I have ever met. On May 23, 1945, Captain Wilfred Kesterton wrote to his sister in Washington from the Canadian Armed Forces Base in England to say, "I have made the acquaintance of a pied wagtail, which delights in preening itself outside the window every morning. Less pleasant is the morning song of the cuckoo at about 5 a.m. Poets may write about it, but its charm is vastly overrated. Its song consists of a loud, monotonous, piercing cuckoo, 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 cuckoo for 10 minutes, followed by a 10-second pause for breath, then 10 minutes of cuckoos, and so ad infinitum. The interval between cuckoos is infinitesimal, and the whole effect is pretty depressing." Wilfred always showed a tremendous concern for wildlife, more than a fascination with their variations in behavior, than from any attempt to save them from the ravages of man. When ducks were in the park, swimming in the pool, he had to feed them. He was as concerned for his fellow inhabitant as he was for his fellow man. I never knew him to kill anything, not even a spider, but that may have been more a result of lack of opportunity than his inherent respect for life and nature. Here is another brief audio recording from that same tribute to Eugene Forsey, which you heard earlier. It will bridge the topic between nature and journalism in a way you cannot otherwise imagine.
On another day, Eugene and I came to our bus shelter, only to find a tall young man standing in the doorway, unaware that a panicky sparrow was trapped inside. Forsey was all concerned when we ushered the little bird to freedom. Eugene was a tender-hearted person, and tough-minded, tender-hearted people are the best people.
Wilf did not drive, so he took buses, and despite the relative quietness of Ottawa, the capital of Canada, far from having the maniacal drivers of larger cities like Toronto and Montreal, Wilf was not immune from accidents. Wilfred Kesterton was a record keeper. He had to remember those small, easily forgettable details that abounded in the life of a professor. To this end, he was carrying with him in May of 1976 a 5-year diary. There was very little space for each day, with each day organized on the same page for all 5 years. On May the 7th, 1976, an event occurred that brought out the calm, quiet, and orderly journalist in Wilf that goes above and beyond the call of duty. Due to a lack of space and an expertise for conciseness, here's what happened to Wilf in his own words as recorded in that diary. Note that never once did he betray the diary's structure and cross a line from the current year into the following year, but filled the days of May 1976, reclaiming space he had lost from those days while recovering. Friday, May the 7th, 1976, 9:15 a.m. Waiting for a 77 bus to Carleton at corner Bronson and Homewood. Traffic silent. Dark car stopped at Bronson Homewood traffic light, adjacent curb Bronson. Appreciable stop. Sound of approaching car going south along Bronson. Sound of brakes being applied. Dilemma of where to go. If in front of car at curb, possibility of it being hit by rear-end collision and having it driven into me. Sudden appearance brownish. Too much brown but otherwise beige. Car traveling right of stopped car onto sidewalk going south. Decision to jump in air so would land on hood and not be forced under hood. Partially successful. Car struck lower left leg, slid along hood until stopped by windshield. Car struck stoplight standard, propelled forward off hood, believed landed on damaged leg. Standard cracked and fell down on me across chest, but did not touch chest. Apparently something projecting supported it. Futile attempt to push off. Heard someone yell, "Somebody call an ambulance." Screamed because felt better. 2 men removed posts. Impulse to get up. Nothing happened. Perhaps restrained. Someone placed cloth material under head. Face covered by coat. Either 2 policemen or 1 policeman plus man who seemed to be in uniform. Policeman asked name, age, where I lived. Brief question, what happened? Said was waiting at bus stop for 77 going south to Carleton when car stopped in front of me near curb, probably because traffic light red. Apparently car came up behind and in attempt to avoid rear-end collision, swung around right side of stopped car onto sidewalk and hit me. After what seemed like 5 minutes, ambulance arrived and took me to Civic Hospital. About 20-member emergency team inquired diabetes and other afflictions, tested positive x-rays for other possible injuries, not at site of fractured lower left leg. However, left leg x-rayed. Trousers and shorts cut away. Woman inquired whom I wished to notify. Given painkiller. Anesthetist explained I would have sore throat because tube inserted down it for operation. Permission to operate. Signed. Operation. Dr. Warren Castle, surgeon. Compound fractured tibia and part of ankle and heel area smashed. Recovery room. Went to bed 4. Room 2102, 2 Southwest Wing, Civic Hospital. Units of blood being given. On intravenous for 2 weeks, so antibiotics might be given. Antibiotics administered orally thereafter. Catheter for about 10 days. Bowel movement problem 7 days. Commodes. Pain shots and pain pills in early stages, but required none except on special occasions such as first-time dressing changed, and nights after skin graft and after leg framework adjusted to straighten leg. In addition to Dr. Warren Castle, Dr. Jacques Destoris participated in treatment, on wheelchair frequently after 2 weeks, while on intravenous nurse technician frequently changed needles because needle went interstitial. What follows is numerous lists. Wilf Kesterton was both grateful and respectful of the kindnesses from others, and if he was going to write future thank you notes, he needed to have precise and full names. I won't list them all, but I'll summarize what followed with his headings. Doctors 7, orderlies 5, Nurses, 18. Fellow patients, 11. Visitors, including those who visited while he was asleep, 53. Flowers or presents, 16. Cards or letters, 27. Phone calls, 4. Reading, 16 books or various other publications. New patients, 6. Cards and letters, 72. Flowers, 10. Other patients, 6. Further visitors, 7. Physiotherapy department, 2. Card, 2. Orderly, 1. Nurses, 6. Reading, 10 publications. Books received, 10. Gifts, chess set, ghost story, chocolate-covered nuts, maple sugar candy, jigsaw puzzle. The final entry is impressions of book read, 1 book in detail. Do you think if you had been hit by a car in similar circumstances that you would have received the attention and respect of so many people, and that you would have taken it upon yourself to outline in detail the first and last names of each and every person whose path crossed yours during the recovery period? I certainly would not. Wilf was a supreme journalist, a detail-oriented writer, and infinitely respectful of all of his contacts, including strangers in the next beds and orderlies, the only group missing being the cleaners. Among his effects was a 22-page document entitled Personal Reminiscences, 1933 to 1983, when he was ages 19 to 69. The early part outlined his days as a prairie teacher. He started with his days at high school by commenting on various teachers. Mr. McLeod, we never seemed to know first names, considered that the most heinous sin a teacher could commit was to draw a map of Canada and omit Prince Edward Island, the island, as he affectionately called his native province. Of course, you all know that PEI did not enter Confederation until 1949, the islanders having had long enough to think about it, 82 years, and they kept the rest of Canada in suspense, thinking that PEI would have become an American state. Wilf was a true Canadian, and this was an important point. In the principal's message in the front of the Aurora, the normal school yearbook, G.D. Ralston admonished students to aim to talk truthfully and tactfully, and to act frankly and quietly. Quiet tact was the hallmark of the normal school principal. Not unusually, those directions defined Wilf's personal behavior. During my normal school days, I had no experience to match those of students who subsisted on a diet that consisted almost entirely of porridge. I was lucky enough to live in Regina with my parents and had no room and board expenses. But like most normalites, I had no money in my pockets. Purchase of a chocolate bar was a major investment, and a visit to a movie was a once-a-year event. After showing respect for some of his former teachers and fellow students, Wilf writes, "With my classmates, I was graduated from Regina Normal School in May 1933. I got my first teaching position in March 1934. Employment came after I had written 150 letters of application to rural schools throughout the province. In those days, all letters had to be written by hand, because school board members had to be able to assess the handwriting of teacher applicants. When I left Regina to take up my duties, my train departure scene in Regina might have served as a prototype for the similar Why Shoot the Teacher scene, which was supposed to have taken place 1 year later. Up to the end of term in June, I taught 59 students in 10 grades. I felt I was a failure trying to perform an impossible task. When I first called on grade 1 pupils to read from the grade 1 Canadian Reader, class members sailed right through the text. But when I covered up the pictures in the reader, those same pupils could not read a word. The blackboard had a big hole in it, left there, so my students told me ad nauseum, by a predecessor 2 or 3 years previously, when he had lost his temper and punched the blackboard with his fist. Dust storms, drought, and poverty were the words most appropriate to that part of Saskatchewan where I taught. When I began to teach school, I would look westward each afternoon, and each afternoon I would see a black cloud forming. Slow to learn, I would say each day, "At last, here comes the rain. The drought will soon be broken." Invariably, as each cloud grew closer, it would take on a reddish tinge. Shortly, we were in the midst of a swirling dust storm. Prairie dust was so intimate. It was part of breakfast, lunch, supper, sleeping, waking during the first hellish week when I tried vainly to settle into a teacherage with a front door the bottom edge of which came 1 inch short of meeting the door frame. The windows, both inside ones and the storm doors, had been nailed shut, apparently in a vain attempt to keep out the ubiquitous dust. Dust made its presence felt again when my bush school took its team to play softball against a team from a neighboring school, which was being taught by a normal school contemporary. Our team rode in a truck which ran on distillate, a crude purple fuel that was issued by the government and was supposed to be used only for planting, cultivating, and harvesting crops. The journey would have been more pleasant if we had not had to pile out of the truck periodically to push it through dust drifts, which impeded our progress just as effectively as the winter snow drifts would have done. Horses were weak animals in southwest Saskatchewan in 1934. Their staple diet seemed to be Russian thistle. A pasture of the farm where I boarded was strewn with their carcasses. During my St. Boswell's days, I saw many a stripped-down car chassis, but never attached to a horse to form a notorious Bennett buggy. Apparently horses were usually too weak to pull even such a light vehicle. Clothing was important. I found this out when I walked 4 miles to deliver some teaching materials to a neighboring teacher. Just before I came to his home, I had to go through a barbed wire fence. In doing so, I cleverly avoided every barb, only to have the paper-thin trousers of my one and only suit split at the seat in spectacular fashion. I confronted my teaching friend without embarrassment because I was wearing a light top coat which covered my shame. But I hadn't counted on receiving an invitation to supper. Today I like to think I would have handled the situation matter-of-factly and with aplomb, but the invitation of my would-be host and his wife was cordial and importunate. My resistance was determined. Thus there was the spectacle of an undignified wrestling match, with my friend struggling to remove my coat and me struggling to keep it on. I won and left. The couple must have thought me a churlish fellow. One winter night in 1935 or 1936, I went out into the yard of the farm where I boarded. The reading on the thermometer was 64 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, which is minus 53 Celsius. But the reading was not official. The radio reported a Regina reading of only 54 below, which is minus 48 Celsius. On nights such as this, one left the kitchen, the only heated room in the house, to face the bedroom cold. If one survived the frigidities of entry into bed, the feather tick soon brought unsurpassable warmth. Many parents formed their opinion of the teacher on the basis of the yearly Christmas concert he directed using the talents of his pupils. I found the exercise a sometimes stressful and emotional one. Care had to be taken not to give some students too big a part, while others received a part that was too small. Jealousies had to be avoided. Usually the feelings most likely to be hurt were those of the parents. A special problem was the pupil who was a slow learner and whose memory was unreliable. To forestall such personal frictions, I wrote some of the recitations and parts of the plays in both of the concerts we offered during the 2 years I was at Bluffview School. In June 1937, the well-loved Gordon Baird gave up the principalship of the Edenwold School, and I was asked to replace him. The senior room contained about 25 students in grades 9 to 12. I taught them all their courses except German. The subject that caused me most concern was biology. I had not a biology lesson in my life. I managed to scrounge one complete set of specimens from a Regina Central Collegiate biology teacher. Because I had only one set, I could not practice dissection beforehand. The best I could do was bone up each lesson one step ahead of the class, studying the diagrams carefully. During dissection in class, I was disconcerted to find there were no dotted lines on the actual specimens. During the early lessons, the reproductive process of the amoeba and similar animals presented no problems. But as we moved to higher and higher orders of animal life, I became increasingly nervous. The 7 or 8 member class was all female. One member was older than I was, and the rest were not much younger. When it came to considering the animal in the course, which was the highest on the biological scale, I approached the lesson with considerable dread, but I needn't have worried about the girls. They considered the vital functions of even the higher orders of animal life with such calm, accepting equanimity that I was at ease at once. It was disconcerting and disappointing that when departmental exam results came in, my senior and junior matriculation students got higher marks on biology and similar subjects than they did on English literature. Literature was my favorite subject, and I taught it with a special love. But perhaps it is understandable that English marks should be low when it is remembered that German was the first language in the homes of many of my students, and that a characteristic idiom of excited schoolyard soccer games was hit it a kick with your foot. In successive years I taught at Albert, Herchmer, and Imperial schools. Life was more comfortable now, and we Canadians sensed that we were moving out of the Depression, but we realized that the greatest stimulus to the economy was a war in Europe. I joined the Canadian Army as a volunteer in September 1942. I took my basic training in Regina. By the end of 6 weeks, I had become the lowest form of Army life, an acting lance corporal without pay, which translated means an acting corporal receiving the pay of an untrained private. My platoon, their training completed, were dispatched overseas, but with 1 or 2 colleagues, I was kept on as an instructor in the unit's NCO school. Early in 1943, I was selected for officer training at Gordon Head near Victoria, British Columbia. During the selection process, we were interviewed and addressed by 2 or 3 high-ranking officers, each one of whom told us solemnly, "An officer looks after his horses first, his men second, and himself last." Our training was most physically demanding during the second month when we took battle drill, training on the far side of Mount Douglas, and ran daily over that mountain and 5 miles into camp. A fellow platoon member during the first month was Pierre Burton. He was a particular favorite when tired platoon members were returning to camp in jolting 60-100 weights after grueling night training schemes. He led his fellow soldiers in songs in which ribald lines alternated with lines of tender, caressing harmony. His parody of the Gordon Head graduation ceremony was superbly funny, and he showed himself to be a cartoonist of marked ability. Gordon Head gave me the first pip of a second lieutenant. To earn the second pip of a first lieutenant, I went to the infantry unit A-15 in Shiloh Camp, Manitoba. My Shiloh training over, I became officer of a platoon of C Company. Our task was to prepare infantrymen for service overseas. In Suffield, we took a particularly restrictive secrecy oath. I do not now know which of our experiences are any longer sensitive. As the war dragged on, I had some guilt feelings about still being in Canada. Then it was announced that a course for medium machine gunners was being set up. The course completed, graduates were to be sent immediately overseas. With large misgivings, I volunteered. Those misgivings grew when knowing veterans quoted such aphorisms as, "The average life of the medium machine gunner in battle is 2 minutes." But my fortitude was not tested because the course was cancelled. Shortly after that, we did finally set out for Europe on a regular draft. Everyone got sick alternately, with measles, following mumps, following chickenpox, following whooping cough, following scarlet fever, in some such haphazard order. We were under constant quarantine. Finally, the quarantines ended. We left Halifax for Liverpool. Our ship was the SS Pasteur. Because it was fast, we didn't go in convoy. Moreover, the submarine menace was no longer great. The last 2 destroyers escorted us almost into the harbor. An overnight train ride brought us from Liverpool to Aldershot, where we lived in barracks designated by names from Wellington's campaigns. It was now the spring of 1945. The Allies were winning. Some nights we were kept awake for what seemed like hours as armadas of airplanes formed up overhead in readiness for raids on the continent. When the planes returned, each would fire a pistol flare. When the flare was green, there were not wounded aboard. When the flare was red, there were wounded. On the few occasions I visited London, none of the V-2 rockets fell very close to where I was. And when VE Day ended the war in Europe, I had never seen a bullet fired in anger. Wilf saw so little action that he wrote to his sister on January 4th, 1946. "When I visited Aunt Ada and Uncle Jim, I saw 4-year-old Jacqueline. She told me about air raids, and I read her a bedtime story." December 25th, 1944. Location, Atlantic Ocean. This ship has quite a reputation as a roller coaster, but the sea is so calm that there is hardly a roll, except when the ship alters course, as she frequently does. It is very beautiful outside. The sun is out and the ocean is very blue. At dusk we see the big Hudson planes as they circle the ship. Besides, I will try to swipe a copy of the ship's menu, although chances of getting one are pretty slim. The reason I want it is for its heading, Christmas Day, 1944, at sea, February 11th, 1945. Right now I'm listening to the radio as I write. There is a continuous Allied Expeditionary Forces program which culls the cream of news broadcasts, music, comedians' programs, and guest star appearances. It is a real treat to be able to listen to hours and hours of entertainment without once being bothered by a lot of stupid advertising. May 7th, 1945. Tomorrow is to be VE Day, and our neck of the woods is getting ready for the occasion. Not that there's any undue excitement here, but only a kind of curiosity to see what it will be like to be at peace again. All the streets and shop fronts are bedecked with flags, British, American, Russian, Chinese, Norwegian, and dozens I can't even identify. Everything is very quiet now, but things may be different tomorrow. Mr. Churchill is to speak at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the King at 9 o'clock at night. Some weeks after VE Day, I was promoted to captain. Shortly thereafter, 2 other captains and I were sent to Amsterdam to serve as escort to a Canadian officer arrested on charges of black marketeering in Holland. August the 8th, 1946. Arrived in Sandown the night of VJ Day. Mrs. Holliday and I went to see the local festivities together. Everybody had congregated on the long stretch of beach to watch the large oil-fed bonfire that had been built. Nobody was wildly exuberant, although large sections of the crowd made valiant efforts to sing. I saw one ragged urchin walking down the boardwalk and singing Good King Wenceslas, most inappropriate considering that it was a hot August evening. We were at the back of the crowd where the view of the bonfire was none too good. One lady lifted her fox terrier up to see the flames and quite seriously pointed out what he was to see. The dog merely looked bored. I suppose it is hard for people to get excited about a medium-sized bonfire after they have seen fire raids and buzz bombs. On October 14, 1945, Wilf wrote to his sister back in Washington, D.C. Thanks for the good words regarding captaincy. Said promotion came as a prize for the winner of a beauty contest between Betty Grable and me. She didn't stand a chance. In Amsterdam, I alternated escort duty with my fellow escort, the routine of duty being 48 hours on and 48 hours off. Because of the responsibilities of the office, I felt more like a prisoner than the prisoner did. The prosecutor was Clarence Campbell, later to become president of the National Hockey League. On March 21, 1946, he wrote to his sister back home. We had a pleasant walk around Amsterdam, which is almost undamaged by bombs. Bicycles are all over the place and everyone rides them. Some of the children wear wooden kloppen or clogs, and many of the workmen and farmers do likewise. The purchase of a new pair of shoes usually entails permission from the mayor and an interminable wait, which probably accounts for a large proportion of the wooden shoes. A single urchin walking along the road is reminiscent of the milkman's horse clomping along the road at 6 a.m., while the sound of 50 school children charging down upon a miniature football is a positively hair-raising experience. I returned to Canada in January 1947 on the SS Aquitania, which was part troop and part war bride ship. I was discharged from the Canadian Army in February 1947. Return to civilian life offered an opportunity for a career change. Writing had been a first love, so I sought further training to prepare me to follow that calling. For me, the best way to prepare for what I had in mind was to enroll in the journalism program, which had been established in Carleton College, now a university. Although having the necessary liberal arts component of the Bachelor of Journalism degree through my studies at Queen's, I might have earned the journalism degree in 1 year, but I chose to use some of the many credits I had in order to study an additional year. My purpose was to enrich my liberal arts background. I was class medalist when I was graduated in 1949. Wilfred Eggleston, director, immediately asked me to become the second full-time faculty member of the journalism department. During the academic term, I carried out my teaching duties in the Ottawa institution, but during the first 3 summers I also worked for Canadian dailies. In 1949 for the Regina Leader-Post as a reporter, in 1950, the year of the flood, for the Winnipeg Free Press as a reporter, and in 1951 for the Ottawa Citizen as an editorial writer. During that period, I was a fairly active freelancer. It was particularly satisfying to have published articles on Glastonbury, Nelson's flagship, The Victory, Stonehenge, bell ringing in England, and similar articles from material gathered while I was serving with the Canadian Army overseas. During the early years of the 1950s, I resumed my Army association when, with the rank of captain, I became second in command of the Carleton contingent of the Canadian Officers Training Corps, and then, with the rank of major, as the commanding officer of that unit. I retired in June 1980. Because I was appointed Professor Emeritus, I have been allowed to teach one course. This has meant no decrease in workload. Even during the last academic term, when a bright young practicing lawyer joined me and shared the lectures, I seemed as busy as ever. But for the current term, I have turned over the administrative chores and most of the marking to a graduate student. I feel that at least I am living a life of luxurious ease, which is why I finally have time to write garrulous reminiscences such as this one. Wilf remained as Professor Emeritus until 1986. He died in Ottawa in 1997.
Welcome to the 2008-2009 Kesterton Lecture. It was named in honor of the late Professor Wilfred Kesterton, who was a part of the school almost from its inception in the 1940s. Wilfred Kesterton established the school's dual emphasis on university education and professional instruction. He was a meticulous writer who valued clarity of expression. The author of the first comprehensive history of the Fourth Estate in Canada, he emphasized that the accomplished journalist was not merely curious about the world of the present, but knowledgeable about the past. Above all, he cared deeply for his students and did all he could to encourage their enthusiasm and further their ambitions. This is a value that the school's faculty upholds to this day.
Everyone's excited down at my house. Everyone's delighted there. Soon you'll be invited down to my house, down to a joyous affair. Can't you see I'm happy, happy and gay? See the looks of joy in my eyes. You'll never guess why I'm feeling this way, so here's the reason why. Somebody's coming to my house, somebody's coming to stay. Father feels so happy, he's jumping with joy. All he keeps saying is, I hope it's a boy. Welcome is waiting the stranger who'll come to brighten our lives. I can hear Mother croon, he'll be president soon when the cute little stranger